Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how we do it here. We take these dense, complex reports, we dig in, and we pull out the essential knowledge you need. Today, we're tackling a really significant piece of work. It's a comprehensive, multi-hazard assessment looking at current and future risks across Europe. We're talking about a report built on some serious expert analysis covering, I think, 47 different kinds of threats. It's a lot. Our mission, for you listening, is to really cut through all that detail. We want to pinpoint the most critical findings, where are the threats getting worse, and maybe more importantly, how do these risks connect in ways that could cause, well, real systemic problems?
Absolutely. And I think to really grasp the weight of the findings, you need to understand just how rigorous the source material is. This wasn't just rehashing old ideas. It was a highly structured collaborative effort. They called it a knowledge mapping exercise. Over 50 specialists involved from the Joint Research Center, that's the JRC, the EU science arm, and also experts from DG ECHOS, which handles emergency response.
Right, the JRC and ECHO. So the people who really live and breathe this stuff day in, day out.
Exactly. And they built this whole assessment around what they call an all hazards and all of society approach.
Okay, all hazards. Let's break that down. Does that mean literally everything?
Pretty much anything that could cause widespread harm. So yeah, pandemics, cyber attacks, floods, heat waves, but also things maybe less obvious like, say, extreme space weather, solar flares, disrupting technology. It's a very wide net.
Okay, got it. So they looked at everything. After all that intense work, drilling down into 47 risks. What's the big headline, the single most crucial takeaway for Europe over the next decade? What should really be grabbing policymakers' attention right now?
Well, the central finding is quite stark. While Europe has certainly dealt with some very costly disasters in the past, the analysis shows a clear, increasing trend in the potential impact for the next 10 years.
An increasing trend. Okay, that's worrying in itself.
It is. But here's the really critical part, the insight that changes the game. The biggest growth and potential impact isn't expected to come from the immediate physical damage. It's projected to come from the indirect consequences.
Okay, let's pause right there. Indirect consequences. That feels like it flips the whole script on how we usually think about disasters, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because, historically, when a disaster strikes a flood, an earthquake, we focus on the visible stuff, the collapsed bridge, the flooded homes, the direct physical damage. That's what hits the news.
That's the immediate picture, yes.
But you're saying that's no longer the primary concern going forward.
Yeah.
That these indirect impacts are actually becoming the bigger threat. What makes them so much worse than what we've seen before?
It's about the complexity, the interconnectedness of modern society, and the sheer ripple effect. The direct physical damage, while still devastating, is increasingly being overshadowed by this unseen, domino effect. We're talking about things like massive business interruptions. Think about supply chains grinding to a halt.
Right, one factory floods somewhere and suddenly car parts are missing halfway across the continent.
Exactly. Or long-term societal consequences that are incredibly difficult to even measure straight away. Impacts on mental health, displacement, loss of trust. The analysis strongly suggests that in the future, these indirect losses are set to far outweigh the more easily quantifiable physical damages.
So it's like the initial shock, the hammer blow, might be survivable for the system as a whole.
Yeah.
But it's the long, slow bleed, the economic disruption, the social strain that really poses the bigger, more insidious danger.
That captures it very well. And this trend, this rise of indirect impacts, it's not uniform across all risks. It's particularly pronounced in certain categories.
Which ones specifically?
So the report highlights biological hazards, think pandemics, antimicrobial resistance, environmental risks like pollution events or biodiversity loss, technological disruptions, which is a huge category, and of course, cyber threats.
Okay, so bio, environmental, tech, cyber. What connects those? Why are they the ones driving these indirect costs?
Because they disproportionately hit our interconnected systems. Things like critical infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, water supplies, global commerce, financial systems, and crucially, health services. Think about it. A major cyber attack might cause almost zero direct physical damage. no buildings fall down. But if it cripples hospital networks across multiple regions for days or weeks,
The human cost, the economic cost from lost productivity, the long-term health impacts,
yeah,
yeah, it would be astronomical, far beyond any physical damage metric.
precisely. The indirect consequences cascade outwards.
You know, what's fascinating here is how this challenges our traditional risk perception. We often rate risks based on historical losses, right? What's caused the most damage in the past.
That's been the standard approach, yes.
But this report flags things like you mentioned sophisticated AI threats or maybe major space weather events, things where we have very limited historical loss data, maybe none at all. Yet they project potentially massive future impacts.
Exactly. And why? Precisely because of those cascading indirect consequences we were just talking about. Their potential to disrupt deeply embedded systems is immense, even if they haven't happened on a large scale yet.
It really signals that our old risk models, the ones based purely on looking backward, are, well, they're becoming fundamentally inadequate, aren't they?
Inadequate is a good word. We're trying to assess threats that, in some cases, simply didn't exist in their current form even a decade ago, or threats whose context has completely changed.
Which leads us perfectly into this idea of the new threat landscape.
Mm-hmm.
If historical data isn't enough anymore, what are these new or newly dangerous threats we need to wrap our heads around? The report seems to split them into emerging risks and high-impact, low-probability HILP events. Let's tackle emerging risks first. What defines those?
Right. So an emerging risk isn't necessarily something brand new under the sun. It could be, but it can also be a risk that's just incredibly difficult to assess using our standard methods. Maybe the data is lacking or the dynamics are changing too fast. Or it could be a familiar risk, like a flood, but appearing under completely unfamiliar and much more dangerous conditions, maybe interacting with other stressors.
And technology seems to be a massive driver here.
Huge driver, absolutely.
Okay, give us the top examples from the report. What should be on our radar?
Well, artificial intelligence risks are definitely high on the list. The sheer potential there is, well, it's broad. You have risks from accidental misuse, unintended consequences spiraling out of control, cybersecurity vulnerabilities inherent in complex AI systems.
And the terrifying one, the potential loss of human control over highly capable AI models.
That's certainly part of the spectrum of concern. The challenge is assessment. The technology is evolving at such an exponential rate. It's incredibly hard to model future failure modes accurately.
Okay, AI is one. What else?
Another really key area highlighted is the intersection of technology and climate change. Specifically, something called NATEC.
NATEC.
Yeah, it stands for Natural Hazard Triggering Technological Disasters.
Okay, so like you mentioned before, a natural event, say a massive storm, causing a secondary industrial accident, a chemical spill, a plant explosion.
Precisely that. And the reason it's flagged as emerging is because climate change is fundamentally altering the frequency and intensity of the triggers. We're seeing more extreme hydrometeorological events, intense rainfall, coastal storm surges, rapid flooding. That means a higher probability of, say, floodwaters breaching containment at an industrial facility or extreme heat causing critical cooling systems to fail. The underlying risk is growing because the natural hazard landscape itself is changing rapidly.
Right, the triggers becoming more common and more powerful.
Exactly, and it's not just new tech or tech-related risks. Even some very old, familiar natural hazards are now shifting into this emerging category.
Which ones? I thought we had a decent handle on things like fires and droughts.
Well, that's the point. We thought we did, based on historical patterns. But the report classifies droughts and wildfires as emerging risks now.
Why? Just because they're happening more often?
It's more than just frequency. It's the intensity, the scale, and the sheer unpredictability, all fundamentally driven by climate change. Fire seasons are starting earlier, lasting longer, burning hotter, and appearing in regions that rarely saw major fires before. Droughts are becoming more severe, multi-year events in some areas. The conditions have changed so dramatically that decades-old patterns and models are no longer reliable guides. We're operating in unfamiliar territory, which makes managing them, predicting them, deeply challenging. That's what pushes them to the emerging classification.
Okay, that makes sense. The rule book has been torn up, essentially. So that covers the new, the unpredictable, the hard-to-assess risks. Now let's pivot to the other category you mentioned, HILP events, high impact, low probability. These are the ones we tend to think of as, the black swans. The truly catastrophic, but hopefully very rare events, things like extreme solar storms knocking out satellites and power grids, maybe major nuclear incidents or complex pandemic outbreaks, far worse than what we've experienced recently.
Yes, those are classic examples. Events that are statistically rare, maybe haven't happened in recorded history or only centuries ago, but if they did happen, the impact could be society-altering, potentially civilization-level threats. However,
Mhm.
there's a really serious, really urgent point the report makes about one specific subset of these HILP risks, and that relates to Earth system tipping points, ESTPs.
Right, the big ones. Things like the collapse of major ice sheets, shifts in ocean currents like the AMSC, dieback of rainforests. These large-scale, potentially irreversible changes to the planet's fundamental operating systems.
Exactly those. And here's the most sobering message from this analysis. We can no longer comfortably categorize all ESTPs as low-likelihood events. That P in HILP, the probability is changing, and it's changing quickly for some of them.
So, wait. You're saying the report indicates some of these planet-scale tipping points are moving from the realm of maybe someday far in the future to potentially much sooner.
The analysis is stark. It strongly suggests that at least 5 of the 16 globally identified tipping points are facing a serious risk of crossing irreversible, destabilizing barriers if global average temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels.
1.5 degrees,
Yeah.
which is the threshold we're already dangerously close to or potentially breaching temporarily.
Precisely. Which means these aren't just theoretical risks for future centuries anymore.
Wow, okay, I think we really need to let that sink in for a moment. Risks that many people, maybe even policymakers, might have dismissed as almost science fiction, things potentially thousands of years away. You're saying the science is now indicating they are becoming near-term, urgent concerns.
That's the implication. They require immediate, targeted risk assessment. We need much better foresight tools, much more sophisticated monitoring. Because their impacts aren't gradual or linear, they could be abrupt, massive, and fundamentally irreversible. You can't just manage the consequences of a collapsed AMOC. You have to prevent crossing the threshold in the first place.
So, just to summarize where we are, we've got new risks emerging constantly, especially from tech and climate interactions. We've got familiar risks like fire behaving in dangerously unfamiliar ways. And now, the truly catastrophic planetary scale risks are potentially moving much closer to the present day than we thought.
That's a fair summary of the shifting landscape, yes.
The inescapable conclusion here seems to be, well, that everything is connected. Which brings us to the systemic nature of risk and what the report calls cascading effects. Can you unpack that? How does an initial failure ripple outwards?
This really gets to the heart of the challenge for modern societies. A cascading effect is essentially when an initial shock or failure could be a natural disaster. A tech outage, a pandemic wave triggers a sequence of disruptions across multiple interconnected human subsystems. One domino knocks over the next, then the next. When the experts involved in this report mapped out all those 47 different risks, they didn't just look at the risks in isolation. They specifically analyzed which human systems were most frequently impacted across all those different types of threats.
So looking for the common vulnerability points, the places where modern European society is most fragile.
Exactly. Identifying the weakest links in the chain, you could say?
And what did they find? Which sectors consistently show up as being vulnerable to the widest range of threats?
The results are quite clear and probably won't surprise listeners entirely, but the scale is revealing. The top 3 most frequently impacted subsystems are, number 1, economic disruption. That was found to be affected by nearly 40 of the risks they analyzed.
Nearly 40 out of 47. Wow. So almost any major crisis hits the economy.
Almost guaranteed. Tied very closely is number 2, human health. Also impacted by nearly 40 risks.
Okay, economy and health. Makes sense. What's number 3?
Disruption of essential services. This includes things like power, water, communications, transport. This category was impacted by approximately 30 of the risks studied.
So the takeaway is, a major shock hits. Doesn't really matter what kind of shock. Could be a flood, a heat wave, a cyber attack, a pandemic. And it's almost certain to simultaneously damage the economy, overwhelm health systems, and compromise critical infrastructure like power and communications.
That's the systemic vulnerability laid bare. The interconnectedness means shocks propagate widely and hit multiple vital areas at once.
Let's make this really concrete for people listening. Can we use a real-world example from the report that shows how a seemingly single hazard can rapidly spiral into one of these complex, multi-hazard, cascading crises?
Absolutely. The report uses the recent compound disaster in Greece as a very potent case study. You might remember there were devastating wildfires.
Yes, huge fires, very destructive.
followed very quickly by truly catastrophic flooding from Storm Daniel. Now, the analysis connects these dots. Exceptionally high sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean, a direct consequence of climate change, fueled the extreme torrential rainfall associated with Storm Daniel.
So climate change amplified the storm's power.
Significantly, this led to unprecedented flooding, particularly in the Thessaly region, which is a major agricultural area for Greece. So immediate impact. Agriculture wiped out. That's a huge economic hit.
Right, the economic disruption box is tits.
Then the floodwaters caused severe damage to infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings. This led to mass displacement of people from their homes and completely shut down essential services in large areas. Power, water, everything.
Yeah, essential services, disruption, displacement. That's ticking more boxes.
And the combination of the preceding fires and the subsequent floods created a widespread sense of public insecurity, stress on emergency services, and long-term recovery challenges. You see how it started with maybe wildfires and then heavy rain, but it rapidly evolved into a complex, intertwined crisis hitting the economy, infrastructure, public health, social stability. That is a perfect, tragic illustration of a cascading effect in action.
That Greece example really drives it home. It shows exactly why the old way of thinking, the fire department just plans for fires, the water utility just plans for floods, everyone stays in their own silo, is completely obsolete now. It doesn't work when the reality is interconnected chaos.
It's dangerously inadequate for the world we live in now.
Okay, so if the future is systemic, if these cascading effects are the norm, what are the current roadblocks? What structural gaps did the report identify that are preventing Europe from building genuine systemic resilience?
Well, the report points to significant gaps on the policy side of things. One major issue is still insufficient investment in risk prevention. There's often a bias towards reactive measures dealing with the disaster after it happens, rather than proactive investment to reduce the risk beforehand.
So spending money cleaning up the mess instead of reinforcing the foundations.
In essence, yes. Another critical point is the limited mainstreaming of what's called disaster risk management, or DRM, into other policy areas. Risk management can't just be a separate box ticked by emergency planners.
It needs to be baked into everything else.
Exactly. It needs to be fundamentally integrated into climate adaptation strategies, into how we plan our cities, into national economic policy, into infrastructure investment decisions. It has to be part of the DNA of governance, not an add-on.
And what about coordination? Especially since many of these risks don't respect borders.
That's another key policy gap identified. The need for enhanced cross-border coordination. Developing truly coordinated prevention strategies and response efforts between neighboring countries is still a major work in progress for many types of transboundary risks, like river floods or industrial accidents near borders.
Okay, so those are some big policy challenges. What about on the ground? The practical, operational side of risk management, are there gaps there too?
Oh, definitely. Operationally, a persistent and major challenge is data, or rather the lack of adequate data.
Data. In what sense?
The report highlights inadequate data collection, monitoring, and especially sharing across several vital risk areas. For example, getting good, localized, real-time flood data is still a problem in many places. Tsunami monitoring networks have gaps. And a particularly concerning area mentioned is tracking cyber incidents, especially within sensitive sectors like healthcare. Without reliable, standardized, shareable data, effective planning, early warning, and rapid response become incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
You can't manage what you can't properly measure or see coming.
Precisely. And beyond data, there are also ongoing challenges with implementation. Even when good policies or plans exist on paper, actually executing them fully and effectively on the ground across different administrative levels often faces significant hurdles, resources, capacity, political will.
So the picture is, we know the risks are becoming more complex and interconnected, but our policies, our data systems, and sometimes our implementation are lagging behind that reality.
That's a fair assessment of the core challenge.
Which means the solution can't just be incremental tinkering. It sounds like it requires that radical shift. The report advocates for this integrated all hazards and all of society approach. How do we actually do that? How does the report suggest we mobilize everyone needed?
It emphasizes that this can't be just a government job. Achieving true resilience requires actively engaging every major societal actor. That means public institutions at all levels, national, regional, local. It means academic and research bodies bringing their knowledge. It absolutely means the private sector, which owns and operates so much critical infrastructure.
And civil society, too.
Crucially, yes. Civil society organizations, community groups, individual citizens, everyone has a role to play. Resilience needs to become a truly shared responsibility, a collective goal embedded across society.
Okay, so it's a whole system effort. What specific actionable steps does the report prioritize right now to start building that kind of resilience effectively? Where should the focus be?
The recommendations cluster around three key areas. First, there's a strong call to invest heavily in multi-hazard, data-driven forecasting and early warning systems. We need to get much better at anticipating these complex compound risks before they hit, not just reacting afterwards.
Using data and modeling to see the cascades coming.
Yes, moving towards predictive capabilities for interconnected threats. Second, the report stresses the need to focus on what it terms smart investments. This particularly means investing in climate-resilient infrastructure.
So not just building new stuff, but making sure it can withstand the future shocks we know are coming. Retrofitting existing systems.
Exactly. Building roads, power lines, water systems, buildings that are designed for future climate conditions and other hazards is ultimately far more cost-effective than repeatedly paying for disaster recovery and reconstruction.
Makes sense. What's the third area?
The third is circling back to that critical issue of data. Data availability, quality, and especially sharing mechanisms must be dramatically enhanced. And importantly, this isn't just about traditional disaster data like rainfall or river levels. It includes integrating economic data, geopolitical intelligence, insights from horizon scanning activities, basically, pulling in signals from much further afield to spot the next potential emerging threat or vulnerability before it fully materializes. We need to broaden our information inputs way beyond the traditional disaster risk management box.
So better foresight through better, broader data, smarter investments in resilience, and getting everyone involved. That seems to be the path forward.
That encapsulates the core strategic direction, yes.
Yeah. This has been a really insightful deep dive. I think you've truly clarified this fundamental shift in Europe's risk landscape. We're moving away from the era of relatively predictable, localized disasters.
Towards a future dominated by systemic, interconnected, often transboundary threats.
Right, where the real, often hidden danger lies in those indirect, cascading consequences that ripple through our economy, our health systems, our essential services.
And where risks we once considered incredibly rare or very far off, like those Earth system tipping points, are now demanding urgent attention.
It paints a challenging picture, definitely.
It does, and that actually leads us to one final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you digest all this. We've talked about risks that operate on vastly different timescales, haven't we? A flood might last days, an economic downturn months or years, but things like the potential destabilization of major Earth systems, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the AMOC ocean current system, for instance, these operate on timescales, potentially ranging from decades to centuries to play out fully, though the tipping point itself could be crossed much sooner.
Right, the really long-term, potentially irreversible changes.
Exactly. So here's the question. Is the most catastrophic, game-changing risks involve these long-term planetary scale shifts requiring sustained global action over decades? How effective can our current risk management systems truly be? Especially when our policies, our political cycles, our funding decisions typically operate on much shorter time horizons, maybe 4 or 5 years, election to election.
That's a deeply uncomfortable question. How do you manage a century-scale risk with a 4-year plan?
It forces us to confront a fundamental challenge, doesn't it? How do we actually govern anticipation itself? How do we build political and societal mechanisms capable of acting effectively on long-term existential threats that operate far beyond typical planning cycles? Something to really think about.